Hi, and welcome to this month's Tips and Tricks video. My name is Dave Hideman, the Application Specialist for the Steel segment here at Trimble. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the AutoConnection function in Tekla, how it works, kind of a brief overview, and then we're going to do a simple example of customizing your output. So first off, you can access AutoConnection by going under your Edit tab, choosing Components, and then Create AutoConnections. And that's going to give you this dialog box here. Now, from AutoConnection, you have two drop-down menus, one for your AutoConnections and one for your AutoDefaults, or your parameters that are going to be used for those connections. Now, I'm in a US Imperial environment, so the settings that I see you may not have in your environment depending on how it was localized. So I'm going to choose, for example, the Clip Angles AutoConnection and the Clip Angles AutoDefaults. These do work together. One choosing the style of the connection or the type of the connection that will be used, and the next would be the properties for that connection once it's inserted. So with clip angles chosen, I'll come in here and highlight my beam to column connection that I have here, and then click Create Connections. And as you can see, it's gone ahead and put a clip angle there, just as we've asked through the AutoConnection settings. Now, one of the neat things about this is that the rules that AutoConnection has in it can actually make this connection automatically change its entire setup depending on the framing situation it's applied to. So as an example of that, if I were to go to this column and change it to be an HSS column, now normally we would not use a clip angle in that type of situation, but the rules in AutoConnection say if you encounter an HSS column, well then we need you to change up the bolting and the welding configuration on this clip. So in this case, it's gone and welded itself to the column, bolted itself to the beam, and then also provided a cope so that this beam can be vertically dropped into place. So that's the type of behavior that you can customize through AutoConnection. Not only inserting the type of connection that you want, but also teaching it how to behave in different scenarios. So to understand this a little bit better, let's take a look at what's actually happening here. If I go to my quick launch and I search for the word auto, you'll see here that we have AutoConnection Settings and AutoDefault Settings. The first one we're going to take a look at is AutoConnection Settings. So the AutoConnection setup here, these are the different drop-down options we saw in the first field on the AutoConnection dialog box. So I used the one called Clip Angles. And if I expand that, there are several framing conditions that are predefined here that are supposed to represent the different types of framing conditions you'll run into in your model space. So we have beam to beam web, beam to beam flange, beam to column web, column flange, and then end to end situations for splices. Now, beam to beam flange sounds a little strange, but if you think of it, a vertical brace or something like that is created with the beam tool, and it's coming down to the top or bottom of a beam flange. So that's what that's supposed to represent, is more of a vertical framing type situation. If I look at this particular condition, a beam framing into a column, and it's specifically the flange, I'm going to expand beam to column flange, and then you can see there's a couple of settings in here. What these actually are types of filters to help identify what's actually happening here. As an example, I've got this skewed to HSS column, or skewed 0 to 45. If I were to right click on one of these and choose Edit Rule Set, we can see what this particular rule is actually doing. Over here on the left, you have the available rules that you can choose from, and over on the right are the ones that's being used and the actual settings being used. So in this case, skewed to HSS column is looking for a beam coming into a column at a skew angle greater than 0, but up to 45 degrees. Okay, so it's got a minimum and a maximum value that's possible with skew angle. And there's all kinds of interesting things you can get here. The profile type, the actual physical profile, the depth, even load values can be put in here. So there's a lot of potential possibilities for what you can set up with your AutoConnection. So once this rule is met, because this is the AutoConnection setup, it's saying, what connection should I use? If there's a skewed situation, a standard clip angle won't work. So what connection should I use in this situation? And if I expand that, you can see that it's currently set up so that if it is not square to an HSS column, we should put in a shear plate 146 instead. Okay, so simple enough. I have a beam framing to a column flange. What kind of column and what's the framing angle? Well, if it's greater than 0 and it's under or up to 45 degrees and it's an HSS column, then I want you to do a shear plate instead of a clip angle. So there's going to be different filters for the different framing conditions in here, and this is going to vary depending on the AutoConnection setup you're in. These are totally customizable, but at the end you're always going to have a default. If none of these other rules are met, what should I do? And if I expand this, you can see that the clip angles default is to use clip angle 141, right? So simple enough. It's going to look at the actual framing condition, beam to column flange. It's going to filter through these rules, and then if none of those are met, it's going to use a clip angle. Okay? So that's the first thing that happens in AutoConnection. The second thing that happens is your AutoDefaults kick in. So AutoDefaults are essentially saying, all right, so in this framing condition of a beam framing to a column flange, we're using 141. What should that 141 look like? Now, in most cases, like this one that I currently still have in the background, standard is probably what's being used. It's just the standard settings. In the US, it's going to be 3/4 inch bolts, 3-inch spacing, blah, 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 right? But if we look at the auto default setup, again, there is one called clip angles. If I expand this and I go find this component number 141. Component 141 in Tekla Structures 2019i, at least, is under Components 14. You can see here clip angle 141 is defined. All of these components are simply broken into groups. Okay, so all of the components in the component catalog are going to be in here. You just have to go and find the one that you're looking for. So under Components 14, clip angle is 141. If I expand this, just like there are certain filters or rules happening under AutoConnection, there are also certain filters or rules happening under AutoDefaults. So in this case, it's saying, all right, you've chosen to use clip angle 141. What should we do with that connection in certain situations? So you can see that there's one called knife connection. And knife connection is actually the rule that we saw kick in when I changed this to an HSS column. So it's saying, okay, you've got a beam framing to a column, you've chosen 141, primary profile type is 8. If you look through the Tekla user assistance, you'll see that an 8 indicates a square tube column or a square tube member, otherwise known in the US as an HSS column. And it's also looking for something that's called column. So if 141 is chosen and you're running into an HSS column, then I want you to use a preset called knife connection. And if we remember from a moment ago, what does knife connection do? Well, knife connection welds it to the column, bolts it to the beam, and puts in a cope on the bottom. So you can see that with the out-of-the-box US settings, we've got a lot of different rules in here for clip angles. Different varying width column flanges should have different gauges. We have some setbacks if it is framing to a web rather than a column flange. And then all the way down here at the bottom, the default, if nothing else happens or nothing else kicks in, it's supposed to use a 5.5 inch gauge. Okay? So you could, in theory, come through and say, yes, use this connection, but don't use Tekla's settings here. I want you to use my settings in these different situations. And you would just come through, edit the rule set, or maybe delete and just start from scratch, and then you can teach this in this situation. I want you to use a specific connection type or a specific connection setting. Okay, so that's a very broad overview, I realize, but hopefully, this video you can kind of go back and watch, and at least gives you a basic working understanding of what's happening here. So let's actually go ahead and take a look at modifying one of these. So down here I have a simple beam-to-beam situation set up where I have a 12 and a 14-inch beam. The 14-inch beam, I have doubled up the bolts, and I've gone ahead and I've saved this shear tab property as 2 rows. Okay, so super simple. What I want to teach AutoConnection to do is, if my beam size is a W14, I want you to do a double row situation. If it's not a W14, well then use your standard single row. Okay, so let's go back up to our AutoConnection settings. And I'm just going to piggyback off the default shear tabs. Now you could come in here and right click and just make a new rule group if you wanted to. I'm just going to go ahead and use the standard beam to beam web, where the default is shear plate simple 146. So I'm not going to really change anything about that. I'm fine with it using a 146. But I wanted to use my saved settings in certain situations. So I'm going to go to the AutoDefaults, and under AutoDefaults shear tabs, going to go back and find that connection, and I just happen to know that it's here under Components 14. You may have to hunt. But under shear plate simple 146, there's only two rules. If there's a skewed situation between 20 and 90 degrees, and we can look at that rule set, so you can see 20.1 up to 90. If that situation is occurring, then I want you to use a setting called skewed. Otherwise, I want you to use the standard. So what I'm going to do is come in here and I'm going to add an additional rule set. So now I've got my new, skewed, and default. So this does read from the top down. So the order of the rules here will change the output that you get. In my case, I'm just going to leave it up here at the top because I don't have anything skewed. So I'm going to say, let's right click on this and edit the rule set. I'm going to call this my double bolted, and I'm going to define the rule. And my rule is if the secondary profile, secondary 1, is a W14. So secondary 1 profile, it says exact value, so I'm going to do a W14. I can use wildcards here, so I'm going to put an asterisk, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Now, my rule is created. So if it is a W14, what should it do? Well, I don't want it to use standard. I'm going to right click here and choose select connection parameters. Go find my saved property called 2rows, and I'm going to hit OK. So now it's going to say if I'm a W14, do 2 rows. If I'm skewed, use a setting called skewed, and otherwise I want you to just use standard. So let's go ahead and test this out. Let's close these. I'm going to delete these two settings, and I'm going to highlight these members, and I'm going to run my AutoConnection shear tabs groups because those are the ones that I modified. So I'll hit create connections, and you can see that it went ahead and put in a 2-row or a double vertical row on my 14. Now if this 14 should change, kind of like I showed you before, let's say it becomes a 16 by 26. It goes back to using a single row connection because that rule group is no longer in play. If I change this back to a W14 and skew it slightly, the rule group says, yeah, we're going to keep that double row because it came before the skewed rule. Okay? So again, some pretty simple examples here, but I hope it at least gives you a basic understanding of how this tool works and gives you some ideas on how you can customize it. This is something that is covered in the advanced training that we offer here in the US, so if it's something you're interested in diving deeper, I would definitely recommend checking that out. If you have any questions or suggestions, as always, leave them in the comment section below, and thank you for watching.